should also be devoted to excellence in exploring the values associated with research and the implications of that research. And for that reason, we were especially proud to coordinate and collaborate with the Center for Vital Longevity because they are among the most successful, powerful, and salutary research institutes at this university. We're very proud to be associated with you. We're pleased to welcome, to say a few words, our co-sponsor of this evening's event. The co-director is Michael Rudd. Michael Rudd is one of the directors of the Center for Vital Longevity. And the other director, whom I'm proud to call a friend as well as a colleague, is Dr. Denise Park.
Much, Dennis. It's always great to be here with you, and thank you all for being here tonight. And I'll tell you just very briefly a little bit about our center. Our center is really focused on the science of the aging mind, and we're trying to understand how the mind works and changes as it ages, because to understand how to slow the process of aging and slow down the rate at which people may convert to Alzheimer's disease or something like that, you have to understand how the mind works. So we do a lot of basic research on the neural circuitry and understanding the mechanics and of how the brain and mind function to create behavior. And we also do interventions that focus on trying to slow the rate at which people age. I don't think we can stop aging, but it turns out if we could slow down the rate that the mind ages by 5 years, we would decrease Alzheimer's disease in this country, the diagnosis of it, by over 50%. So we think the aging society is one of the most critical problems and biggest opportunities at the same time facing our society. If you look at the front page of the newspaper, virtually every article that's domestic, somehow the aging population is intrinsically involved in it, be it Social Security, be it how we're going to allocate our tax dollars, be it workforce issues. All of these things are housing issues. They're all intimately tied up with our aging population. How many of you had the chance to come to the Center for Vital Longevity 2 weeks ago and hear our speaker, Laura Karstensen? Some of you, she talked a great deal about the opportunities that aging affords our society as well as the risks. And I think that it's a very vital science right now. I think it's a front and center issue at this very moment as the baby boomers age and we reach this unprecedented population that has never existed before in history. We've been very successful at extending life in the past 100 years, just remarkably successful, and now we have to figure out how to manage the quality of life and make sure our minds and our bodies age together. And that's the focus of our center, but we also recognize that these scientific problems exist in a context. And I'm very thrilled to partner with the Center for Values in Medicine and Technology, because we think the issues we're confronting as a society are critically important as they relate to values in aging as well. Dennis and I have had many fascinating conversations, and it's truly an honor and a pleasure to do these kind of interdisciplinary things that push the boundaries of what any one individual unit can do. So it's very exciting to collaborate with such an elite group, and would also like to thank Matt Brown, the director of the Center for Values, for his partnership and work on this with us. And so it's truly our pleasure to continue these kinds of interdisciplinary things that really bring together the different disciplines across the university into one forum. And thank you for all coming tonight, and we look forward to doing this each year into the future. And with that, I'd like to ask Dennis to introduce our wonderful speaker tonight.
Thank you, Denise. I'm particularly pleased by the opportunity to introduce Professor William Irvine. As a classicist, I've long been interested in ancient philosophy, especially the writers of Stoic theory, such as the Greek slave philosopher Epictetus and the Stoic philosopher emperor Marcus Aurelius. When I say for a long time, I mean a very long time, and the length of my interest in ancient philosophy is directly proportional to my interest in our topic for the lecture series, which is aging well. Dr. Irvine is professor of philosophy at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio. His first book was the acclaimed study on desire, why we want what we want. Now, as an aside to those of you who had trouble this evening deciding between your desire to pursue wisdom and to listen to the ball game, I hope you appreciate, I don't use our awesome decanal powers often, but we did arrange for rain tonight in St. Louis. Professor Irvine's recent book, On the Good Life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy, attracted the Center Advisory Board, and me in particular, since I deeply admire the magisterial studies of the French scholar Pierre Hadot, who argues in his own books on ancient philosophy, and the Stoics in particular, that ancient philosophy regarded philosophy not simply as a learned discourse, but primarily as a way of life. I regard with particular admiration then Professor Irvine's decision, that I hope he talks about a bit this evening, to adopt this more profound view of philosophy by attempting not merely to write and teach and talk about Stoicism, but to live his life according to the demanding tenets of Stoic philosophy. So please join me in welcoming a thinker with the courage to live his best thoughts.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank Dennis for that very kind introduction. I also want to thank the Center for Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology and the Center for Vital Longevity for inviting me to speak. And most of all, I want to thank all of you for coming out this evening and to hear what I have to say. There were some tense negotiations between Dennis and Major League Baseball over who was going to give way, but in the end he prevailed. I didn't like turning 50. The problem was that I became fixated on the math of aging, and here's how that math goes. Between ages 30 and 50 is 20 years, and as I thought back at age 50 on those 20 years, I realized that they had passed in the blink of an eye. And not only was time passing quickly, but the rate at which it was passing was clearly accelerating. It took forever for me to get through the 4 years of high school. By way of contrast, I'll get through the next 4 years of my life by Thanksgiving. Or so it will seem. My life reminds me of one of those old movies in which, to indicate the passage of time, they show the pages flying off the calendar. That's what it feels like. But to return to the line of reasoning I formed as a 50-year-old, the 20 years from age 30 to 50 had passed in the blink of an eye. But from 50 to 70 was also 20 years, and so it stood to reason that those years would also pass in the blink of an eye, if not faster. But at age 70, I reasoned, you are indisputably old. You may be young at heart and all that, but you are nevertheless old. A geezer, in fact. Well, I'm now 59, meaning that this spring I'll be halfway through my journey between ages 50 and 70. And one premise of my argument has been vindicated, and that is that time is indeed passing with remarkable speed. But I've started having second thoughts about the other premise of my argument, namely that at age 70 you're indisputably old. I no longer think that. Now 80, that's old. But not 70. You know, it'll be interesting in 10 years' time to revisit this talk. Maybe I will have gained some important insights between now and then. Probably not, but you never know. Throughout my adult life, I've searched for role models who were successfully living what for me would be the next stage of my life. Rather than reinventing the wheel in deciding how to live that stage, I thought it made sense simply to imitate those individuals whose wheels were functioning well. Indeed, if you ask me how I got to be the way I am today, I can point to a handful of people that I encountered in the past who served as my role models. I am the way I am in large part because I made it my business to be the way they were. At the same time as I was looking for an autumn years role model, I was engaged in a research project that required me to read lots of ancient philosophy. And what I found is an interesting number of ancient philosophers had not only aged well, but had been thoughtful enough to write down advice on how the rest of us could age well. Not only that, but I found that their advice on aging well had itself aged well and was applicable to 21st century senior citizens. I decided that these ancient philosophers could be used as a role model, and I set out to learn from them what I could about the aging process. And this evening I'm going to be sharing some of the insights that I gained from them. As it so happens, the ancient philosophers who had the greatest impact on my own thinking were those known as Stoics. And as the result of my exposure to them, I found myself transformed into a kind of cultural anomaly. I became not just a Stoic, but with the publication of my book, A Guide to the Good Life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy, I became, in some ways, the poster boy for 21st century Stoicism. And let me add, I was as surprised as anyone by that outcome. Before I share with you the Stoics' advice on aging, let me take a moment to explain to you who the Stoics were and what they weren't. Stoicism was invented by Greek philosopher Zeno of Citium in about 300 BC. Later on, the Romans imported the doctrine and put their own spin on it. There were 4 great Roman Stoics, 3 of whom you've probably heard. Those were Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. They're the famous ones. Their philosophical writings routinely dominate Amazon's ancient philosophy bestsellers list. Stoicism is therefore a rare and hope-inducing example of a philosophical doctrine that's escaped from the clutches of academic philosophers and taken up residence in the outside world, where it's transformed the lives of many ordinary people. The 4th great Roman Stoic is Musonius Rufus. He's not as well known as the other 3 in large part because translations of his work were very difficult to obtain until recently, when my colleague Cynthia King, who's a classicist, and I undertook the project of translating and publishing them. Stoicism is a philosophy of life, and like any genuine philosophy of life, it has 2 components. First, it tells you what things in life are worth attaining, and second, and very importantly, it provides you with a strategy for attaining those things. Stoicism is in fact only one of many possible philosophies of life that you might consider adopting. Some others are ancient philosophies like Epicureanism and Cynicism. Zen Buddhism can also be regarded as a philosophy of life. Indeed, it's the philosophy of life that I was considering adopting until, much to my astonishment, I realized that in order to deal with the challenges of everyday life, I was drawing on the advice offered by the Stoics, and that the advice was working quite well. Different philosophies of life might differ in the advice they give you on what's valuable in life, or they might agree on what's valuable in life, but have different strategies for attaining the thing of value. So curiously enough, Stoicism and Zen Buddhism agree on what's valuable in life. They say tranquility, and it's a word that needs defining to understand exactly what they mean. But they have radically different strategies for attaining that tranquility. It's important to realize that Stoicism and other philosophies of life are not religions. And not only that, but they're compatible with many religions. You can perfectly well be both a Stoic and a Christian. With Stoicism telling you what you need to do to have a good life, and Christianity, if you believe in that, telling you what you need to do to have a good afterlife. So the two can be perfectly complementary. Before I turn my attention back to ancient advice on aging, one more comment is in order. Unless you're an unusual individual, everything you know about Stoicism is wrong. The common belief is that the Stoics were anti-emotion, and that simply isn't true. What they were against is negative emotions, emotions like anxiety, fear, envy, regret, and hatred. They wanted to eliminate those emotions to the extent possible. So they devised strategies to prevent the onset of those emotions, and then secondary strategies to overcome those emotions when the attempt at prevention failed. They had nothing at all against positive emotions, including that most positive of emotions, joy. And so the phrase joyful Stoic is not the oxymoron that you might suspect. So let's turn our attention now to the challenges presented by growing old and to the advice the Stoics, ancient philosophers, and in particular the Stoics offered on how to deal with those challenges. Most of the challenges of aging involve loss. To begin with, there's the loss or impairment of abilities that throughout your life you probably took for granted. These include physical abilities. When you're in your 20s, you can run for miles. When you're in your 80s, you might struggle to make it up the stairs. It includes impairment of your health, your senses, and your memory. It might also include, if you live long enough, the loss of friends and loved ones. They will start dying at an unprecedented rate. Last week, when I was putting the finishing touches on this talk, and was as a result thinking about the losses involved in old age, I took a break to go shop for groceries at a local Walmart. In the checkout line ahead of me was an elderly gentleman. At one point, he turned to me and with a lost child look on his face said, "I've never done this before." I wasn't sure what he meant, and at first I thought he meant that he had never shopped at Walmart before. But then I realized that he had never shopped for groceries before, and it turned out that his wife had recently passed away and that she had done all the shopping. So I explained to him how the checkout process worked, showed him how to swipe his credit card, gathered up my own purchases, went to my car, and when the door was closed, found that I was in tears. An hour before that, the losses involved in the aging process had been for me a subject of philosophical speculation. But now they had acquired a human face. I felt very much for the old man. I also admired what for him must have been an incredible act of courage to go shopping for the first time. And about the crying, don't get me wrong. Being a real man, I don't do much of it. In fact, I frown on it. It's just that life has a capacity for being so beautiful, for being so tragic, and on occasion for being so tragically beautiful, that the most articulate response you can offer is a heartfelt sob. If you offer any other response, it's proof positive that you just don't get it. The Stoics, as part of their philosophy of life, devised strategies for dealing with these and other losses. One very important strategy, in fact, I'd be happy to call it the central strategy of the Stoics, involves what I call negative visualization. The Stoics thought we should periodically take time to contemplate the bad things that can happen to us. They thought by doing this, we could live a happier and more meaningful life. And I know that sounds like strange advice to make ourselves happy by entertaining gloomy thoughts, but let me explain what they had in mind. A Stoic will engage in negative visualization a few times a day. In these visualizations, he'll imagine that he's lost the things in his life that he values. This might include his spouse, his children, his car, his job, is health. It's important to realize that the Stoics don't dwell on the loss of these things because that would be a recipe for a miserable existence. Instead, they contemplate the loss of these things. It's an important difference. And for only a few seconds at a time. So a Stoic's negative visualizations will consist of flickering thoughts about how things could be worse than they are. By visualizing in this manner, the Stoics reasoned, we could overcome the tendency that humans have to take whatever it is they've got, to take it for granted. And they could thereby dramatically increase their satisfaction with whatever life they happen to be living. That's one of the keys to having a good life, is to embrace the life you happen to be living instead of spending that life wishing you could be living some other life. It's a simple psychological technique, but my experience is that it's remarkably effective. In fact, it's a technique I want you all to try out. It can be your introduction to Stoicism. So I want you to imagine yourself learning that someone important to you is lost to you. Imagine, for example, that the person in question has broken off his relationship with you, was forced to move to some distant part of the globe, or has simply fallen down dead. Such things do happen. Maybe your reaction to this exercise will be different from mine, but I find is that whenever I do it, I subsequently experience a little burst of joy on realizing that the relationship is still part of my life. I also think that negative visualization, by making me more appreciative of the people in my life, has made me a better husband, a better father, and a better friend than I otherwise would have been. So let me now explore the ways in which this process of negative visualization can be used to help us deal with the losses that accompany the death of people we know and love. Being old is like living in a time of plague. The people in your age group start dying with disturbing regularity. The Stoics offer advice on how to cope with these circumstances. And the first thing you should realize is that, contrary to popular belief, the Stoics don't think we should suppress our feelings of grief when someone dies. To the contrary, they thought it was perfectly natural for us to experience grief. They said it's an emotional reflex, the way sneezing when you've sniffed pepper is a physical reflex. But the trick with grief is you've got to prevent it from taking control of your life, and you've got to prevent it from dominating the life you subsequently live. And their advice was you should engage in negative visualization with respect to the people who are important to us. While they're still alive, you should contemplate their death. Probably not a good idea to tell them that this is what you're doing. But it's very good advice because it accomplishes two things. First, if the individuals in question do subsequently die, it'll reduce your grief in the sense that you will, in some sense, have seen it coming. And second, and more important, the negative visualizations will help you prevent you from taking friends and relatives for granted. This increases the chance that while they are alive, you will maximally enjoy your relationship with them. Now, you might think that a relationship that you enjoy, the fact that you enjoy it, will increase your suffering if you subsequently die. And indeed, it might increase your immediate reaction to them if they pass away. But the Stoics said that in the longer run, it'll actually decrease the suffering you experience regarding their death. It'll decrease the grief you experience. And let's talk for a second about grief. Grief is a complex emotion. It's made up of bits and pieces of other emotions. And one particularly important ingredient in the emotional stew that is grief is feelings of guilt. Sometimes, maybe even often, people grieve the death of someone because, while the person was alive, they took the relationship for granted. In particular, they assumed that there would always be a tomorrow during which they could enjoy the relationship or express their gratitude for its existence. As a result, when the person died, there remained important unfinished business, and along with it, feelings of guilt. If they had kept in mind that no relationship is forever, they wouldn't have allowed this unfinished business to accumulate, and there would be no reason to feel guilty. So by engaging in negative visualization with respect to our relationships, you accomplish two things. First, you appreciate the relationships to the fullest while it's possible to do so. And second, you can dramatically reduce the pain you experience if the people in question die. And before I continue, let me offer you, as a practicing Stoic, a little bit of unasked for advice. If you in the audience love someone, tell them, not next week, not tomorrow, but soon. Life is simply too short for you to be keeping such things a secret. Let's now turn our attention from the deaths of other people to an even darker topic. I lighten up after a while, but so this is the nadir of the whole thing. So let's consider for a minute our own death. When we're 20, the prospect of dying is a theoretical possibility. If we're 80, if we make it that far, we know full well we're going to die, and we know that it could be any day. It's this knowledge that for many people is the biggest obstacle, the biggest burden of old age. And Stoic Musonius Rufus said, quote, "What makes life most wretched for old people is the fear of death." Now that observation raises an interesting question. Why do people fear death? In some cases, people fear death because of their religious beliefs. They fear that death will involve fire and brimstone hell, and they don't want to spend an eternity there. But suppose your religious beliefs don't include the possibility of a fire and brimstone hell. Even then, someone might fear death, because she fears that there are important things that life has to offer and she hasn't gotten them, and that death will prevent her from ever getting those things. According to the Stoics, the best way to prevent this particular fear from ruining your later years is to figure out, while you're still relatively young, what things in life are worth having, and to devise an effective strategy for attaining those things. In other words, when you're young, you should adopt and follow an effective philosophy of life, of which, as I've said, Stoicism is one. Then when it comes time to die, you won't be vexed by the fear that you missed out on life. You will, to the extent possible, have extracted the things in life that are worth having. And the Stoics thought this would take much of the sting from your ultimate departure from life. Let's now explore some of the other insights the Stoics had, and the way those insights can help us deal with the challenges of old age. Lots of people, when life challenges them, respond by complaining about how unfair the challenges are. They whine and they curse their luck. And this, I should add, is actually how many old people respond to the losses that accompany aging. They spend their days complaining that they can no longer see, no longer walk, no longer drive a car, you name it. These individuals, I have found, tend to be quite unhappy. Not only that, but they tend to make the people who have to deal with them pretty miserable as well. The Stoics, by way of contrast, made a point of responding to life's challenges not by interpreting them as some kind of cosmic punishment, but instead by treating them as a kind of a test of their stoicism. A novice Stoic might take an unforeseen and undeserved hardship as a chance to show the world what she's made of. And that's good. At a more advanced level, though, a Stoic will take such a challenge not as a chance to prove something to the world, because at a more advanced level of Stoicism, you've pretty much stopped caring what most of the world thinks of you. There still will be people you care, but there will be other people, because they don't have a philosophy of life, that their opinions will be less important. He will take a challenge as a chance to test the Stoic techniques he's spent years practicing. Indeed, if life is kind to a Stoic and never presents him with a challenge, he might become disgruntled. He might feel like a fireman who spent years training how to put out a fire, and is never called on to actually put one out. Or a high school football player who trained all season long and the coach never put him in a game, and he's going to be desperate to try out his skills. Ordinary people feel cheated when life beans them with a curveball. A Stoic, by way of contrast, might feel cheated if life never throws a character-testing curveball his way. Thus, when aging presents him with a challenge, a Stoic will respond by rising courageously to that challenge. People who do this, I'm convinced, are far happier than people who respond by whining and complaining. Not only that, but by dealing with challenges courageously, they make themselves socially useful, which is something the Stoics were very much interested in doing. They become role models for the rest of us. Along these lines, I know one woman in her 80s. She is by no means a Stoic. She's in her 80s, and she is slowly but surely losing her eyesight to macular degeneration. I have never once heard her complain, and she has thereby become both a teacher and an inspiration to me. Another useful piece of Stoic advice deals with control. It's pointless, said the Stoics, to concern yourself with something you have no control over. It's a waste of your time. It's a waste of your life. Do that, and all you will accomplish is to cause yourself needless anxiety and frustration. To the contrary, you should concentrate your efforts on things you can control. And applying this reasoning to aging, the Stoics will remind us that you can't stop the downward physical and mental decline that accompanies old age. But you do have it in your power to take steps that will lessen the slope of the decline. So you want the slope to be gentle instead of abrupt. You can, for example, eat right. You can exercise. You can keep yourself mentally active. If your goal is not to grow old, you will be sorely disappointed. If your goal is to grow old slowly and gracefully, you can enjoy incredible success. So that should be your goal. So much for what we lose by growing old. I'm going to use my remaining time this evening to talk about what we gain. And you might think that wouldn't leave me with much to say, that there's little, if anything, to gain from growing old. But the Stoics knew otherwise. Indeed, according to the Stoic Seneca, we should, quote, cherish and love old age, for it is full of pleasures if one knows how to use it. And indeed, he claims that the most delightful time of life is, quote, when it is on the downward slope but has not yet reached the abrupt decline. As we've seen, one of the things that disturbs elderly people is the proximity of death. The Stoics realize, though, that this proximity could also be a blessing. Allow me to explain. My mother, who recently passed away, spent 4 years in a nursing home, and during that time I was a regular visitor. She almost always shared the room with someone else, usually another elderly resident, and this meant that I involuntarily had a front row seat for some interesting intergenerational encounters. One of my mother's roommates was in her 80s, and I was often present when her 20-something-year-old granddaughter would come to visit. The granddaughter would typically spend the visit complaining about her life and listing in detail all the aspects of it that, to use her terminology, sucked. Sorry to use that word, but that's the word she used. This included, as I recall, her classes, her relationship, her car, her lunch options, her apartment, her wardrobe, and not to be forgotten, her hair. And I'd watch, and the grandmother would be taking all this in. And she would try to comfort her by telling her how lucky she was to be young and alive. The granddaughter's jaded exterior, though, made her impervious to such attempts. And it was just striking to see, because compared to this young woman, the grandmother seemed vibrantly alive. And it's just a strange thing. I've seen it also in my own college students, by the way, but I'm not going to go there. This difference in attitude can be attributed, I think, to the difference in their probable proximity to death. When you're in your 20s, it's easy to delude yourself into thinking that there will always be a tomorrow, meaning that little is lost if you squander today. And so squander it you do. And because you've squandered it, when the day draws to a close, you probably aren't feeling particularly good about yourself. By way of contrast, when someone in her 80s wakes up in the morning and sees the ceiling, it's cause for celebration. She has been given another day to live, another blank canvas, as it were, to fill with something beautiful. The Stoics, by the way, think it's possible for the 20-year-old to have the same appreciation as her grandma does. She need only contemplate her own death as part of a program of negative visualization. The Stoics would add that one of the perverse blessings of old age is that the proximity of death forces us to do what we should have been doing all along, and that is contemplating our own death. More generally, the Stoics think it important that we take personal responsibility for our unhappiness. Yes, the world can be unfair to us. And yes, we have little control over the hardships we're dealt. But we have it very much in our power to control our reaction to those hardships. This means that if we let the world's unfairness ruin our life, we typically have only ourselves to blame. What we need, the Stoics argued, is strategies for preventing the world's unfairness from making us miserable. And it was for this reason that they spent a lot of time and energy developing strategies to prevent that from happening. The Stoics thought that people could also gain from what they lose by growing old. In particular, they thought that the aging process, by causing our desires to diminish in intensity, could be a blessing to us if what we want to live is a happy and meaningful life. Consider our sexual desires. When we are young, they have a stranglehold on us. When I was writing this, I was thinking back to geometry class when I was 15 years old. It was amazing that I could keep my mind focused for even one geometry problem, much less a whole set of them. Our sexual desires when we're young are at best a source of constant distraction. And at worst, our sexual desires can cause us to do foolish things, and thereby they have the power to destroy whatever plan we might have had for our life. And in support of this last claim, consider all the people whose lives have been turned upside down by an unwanted pregnancy brought on by an impetuous act. I deal routinely with students who are trying to do the impossible. Single parents, they have a kid that they have to watch, but they have to have a job because the man in their life won't make child support payments. And the man in their life had different plans for his life as well. It is, at some level, quite tragic. But as we age, our sexual desires loosen their grip on us. As a result, we can at long last become sexually liberated. Liberated, that is, from the sexual passions that through much of our life held us in their grip. Thus it was that when Greek dramatist Sophocles had grown old and someone asked whether, despite his years, he could still make love to a woman, he replied, "I am very glad to have escaped from this, like a slave who has escaped from a mad and cruel master." Stoic philosopher Seneca was in agreement. How comforting it is, he said, to have tired out one's appetites and to have done with them. Let me add that I don't know of anyone who would want his or her sexual desires to disappear. But for them to abate somewhat can be nice, inasmuch as there's more to life than sex. Much, much more to life than sex. And oh, by the way, I think Hugh Hefner is an object of pity. I'll just throw that out. Another desire that typically diminishes as we age is our desire for social acceptance. When we're young, we want other people to love us, admire us, or best of all, envy us. As we grow old, though, we develop a sense of who we are and what we've accomplished. We therefore are less willing to knock ourselves out to gain the admiration of other people. As our desire for social status diminishes, so do our social anxieties. As a result, we might grow a bit eccentric. And this is a good thing, since research shows that eccentrics tend to be significantly happier than people who feel constantly, who feel the need to conform to the world's expectations of them. By weakening our desire to impress other people, the aging process presents us with a splendid opportunity to undertake what can be life's last great adventure, and I hope it's the adventure you all embark on, and that's the possibility of having a second childhood. So I'm going to end my talk this evening by giving you advice on how to have a first-rate second childhood. Before I do so, though, a disclaimer is in order. I don't pretend to be an expert on second childhoods, not yet having had one myself. In fact, my wife took a look at this paper and saw this part of it, and she said she doubted whether I would ever be able to have a second childhood. And I said, how come? And she said, well, you'll have to terminate your first childhood. So that's going to be a possibility. That said, I'll add that I've done quite a bit of research on childhood and its essence, and it's this research that I'll be drawing on in the advice I offer. To have a second childhood, you'll have to reacquire some abilities that in your first childhood came to you naturally. One of them is a capacity for play. What is play? Difficult question to answer, but one thing that's clear is that play involves an activity so engaging that while you're doing it, the rest of the world drops away. You lose track of time. You lose yourself within the activity. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon and given it a name. They call it the flow experience. Musicians experience flow. So do scientists doing research. So do mathematicians proving theorems. So do rock climbers on a difficult pitch. And so do children routinely. If you've ever dealt with a child and you've walked up to a child and said it's time for dinner and the child doesn't respond at all, there's a good chance that it's because the child is experiencing flow and you're just outside the world the child is living in at that moment. Experiencing flow can be absolutely wonderful. Indeed, it's arguably one of the highest pleasures life has to offer. And it's strange that that would be the case because, like I said, when you experience flow, you lose yourself. Yourself is something that normally you work so hard to develop and preserve, and then for it to go away, for you to lose it, to be a source of delight. And if you're a Buddhist, by the way, you already know about the flow experience, except you don't call it that. You call it an episode in which you stay in the moment. So it's a similar concept. Although children instinctively know how to trigger flow experiences, many adults have lost the ability. And in many cases, in their attempt to get it back, they try something, and the closest they get to it is by getting drunk. It's true that for the inebriated, time flies and they lose themselves. But a state of drunkenness isn't really a flow experience. It's merely an experience involving fluids, which is something quite different. And how do you regain your ability to play? You must do two things. First, you must stop taking yourself so seriously. You must stop acting like such a grown-up. You must be willing to laugh at yourself. Better still, must be willing to make jokes at your own expense. And if, with the passage of years, your desire for social status has diminished, it'll be much easier for you to do that than it at one time was. And secondly, you need to put yourself in circumstances in which play is possible. So you've got to find an activity in which you can lose yourself. There are a whole bunch of activities in which that's possible. But what you can do to filter out the range of possibilities is look for activities in which people do lose themselves and then think about trying that activity out. Which play activities you experiment with depends on your personality, your physical conditions, your circumstances. But among the activities you might consider are the following. First on the list would be yoga. It's a great reintroduction to play, in as much as your yoga instructor will do things you haven't done since you were like 7. You'll be introduced, for example, to the happy. Anybody out there do yoga? You'll be reintroduced. You'll be introduced to what's called the happy baby pose, where you lie on your back with your feet sticking up in the air, and then you grab the bottoms of your feet with your hands. Now, you've got to admit, that's something no serious-minded adult would ever do. Your yoga instructor might tell you to balance on one leg for an extended period of time, or make funny faces. So at first it seems kind of strange, but then you get into it, and it is play. You might even find yourself, and this was what happened to me, doing things as an adult that you were unable to do as a kid. So I was in my 50s when I stood on my head for the first time. I was quite delighted to have done that, because as a kid I was the one who could never do it. Besides being a reintroduction to play, yoga has other benefits for aging individuals. Helps you maintain your balance, helps you maintain your flexibility. 2 things that the aging process is going to be trying to deprive you of. As part of your second childhood, you might also consider taking up a new sport or having a second go at a sport you played as a child. In my case, a return to sports meant taking up competitive rowing, something I had never done before. And it was really an amazing experience. After work, I would rush to the boathouse and meet 3 other men who had done exactly the same thing. We would get in our boat and start our workout. And it felt remarkably the way it used to feel in high school after class when I'd go to track practice. It was the same feeling. We would get in our boat and the world would drop away. The world would disappear. Now, one difference between what we did in high school was back in high school during the warm-up, we used to talk about girls. Okay. Well, we didn't do that anymore. Now we talked about our wives and what we would have to do to convince them to let us go off and row in some upcoming regatta. So similar but different. And I should add that there's a huge difference between participating in a sport yourself and watching someone else participate. You can learn a lot about yourself by participating in an athletic competition. You can also work on developing character traits such as self-control, persistence, and courage that will serve you well in your later years. For example, the ability in rowing to force yourself to row 5 more strokes even though you're dead tired will help you win races, but more important, it can come in very handy when, because of some health crisis, you have to undergo physical therapy. And in my mom's nursing home, I used to watch this, and there would be some people who would simply go through the motions, and there would be some people who took it very seriously and worked hard at it. When my friends see me out rowing and ask what I'm training for, I usually respond by naming a particular race in a particular regatta. The truth of the matter, though, is that when I'm out rowing and working hard, one of the things I'm training for is my 80s and perhaps my 90s as well. I think it's training that will come in handy. One other plug for rowing is that it's a sport that accommodates the elderly. The older you are, the bigger the time handicap you're given. So that's why in my very first race, I was beaten by a man a quarter of a century older than I was. And this is also the reason I just mentioned the boat with 4 rowers in it. One of those 4 rowers was a gentleman in his mid-70s. We wanted him desperately to join us. We needed his age handicap. And he was happy to come out and give it. Another thing about participating in sports helps you maintain your reflexes, your level of fitness. And you know, all of these things, yoga, some kind of sport, can help you avoid the kinds of accidents, you know, like if you stumble and break a hip, it can help you avoid the kind of accidents that in a matter of seconds can deprive you of abilities that in the natural course of things, the aging process might take years to deprive you of. So it's a very good thing. And what if your physical condition precludes you from taking up yoga or sports? Well, take up a hobby. And again, here the test is the hobby should be an activity in which you can lose yourself. And the list of hobbies is just endless. A few: pottery, painting, papermaking, origami, photography, gardening, musical instrument. You can learn one, or you can relearn one that you once knew. The important thing is that you find something that you can do during the later years of your life and take delight in doing. So in your later years, your goal should be to continue to participate in life rather than being a spectator of your life. You know, the motto should be, while alive, you should live, to the extent possible. Ideally, any of your play activities, any of your hobbies, any of your sports, any of these things will bring you into social contact with other people and thereby help you form new relationships. The Stoics have interesting views on other people. Number one, they concluded that other people are the source of most of the misery and anguish in our life. Other people are a pain, they insult us, they do things to undermine us. But they also realize that other people are the source of some of the greatest delights life has to offer. So the Stoics spent a lot of time developing strategies that would let us interact with other people on an ongoing basis and derive the delights that were possible, while at the same time preventing the other people from driving us crazy. So they had a special interest, for example, in insults. People are very good at insults. Some of them are blatant. Most of them are very subtle insults. And they came up with interesting strategies for preventing ourselves from getting upset by insults, which, by the way, is going to be the subject of my next book, which in a perfect world will be published by Oxford University Press and will be available at finer bookstores next year. That's a plug. Recent research indicates that the Stoics were right to value the presence of other people in our lives, particularly when we get older. And so they did a study in which they, over a 12-year period, they tracked older people. And each year they would have them fill out surveys, and they would ask how socially active they were. And they would also measure the rate of cognitive decline. And what they found out is people who were socially active had 1/4 the rate of cognitive decline from the people who are socially isolated. Surround yourself with people. That's got to be a bottom line thing. And it goes along with the kinds of hobbies and the kinds of sports you can participate in. But regaining your ability to play is only one component of a successful second childhood. The second thing you've got to do is reignite your sense of wonder about the world around you. As a child, your sense of wonder was intact. You didn't know how the world worked, and as a result, you were incredibly hungry to find out. It was just a remarkably interesting place. And so you constantly peppered your parents with why questions. How many of you have recently spent time around a 3-year-old? It's a pretty intense experience, and you will feel as dumb as a rock after about an hour. If you're lucky, your parents were able and willing to answer your why questions, but in many cases, parents don't answer the why questions. They not only don't answer them, but they discourage kids from asking them. And I think that's partly or largely because the parents feel stupid. You'll have a 3-year-old who will ask a pretty obvious question like, why is the sky blue? And the parents will realize they don't know. They don't know. The kid's got to be thinking, and these are the people in charge? How can this be? So you have a lot of parents who suppress why questions. And as a result, the curiosity that's aflame in most 3-year-olds is a burned out cinder by the time they reach age 10. And what a shame this is, because curiosity is one of the best character traits you can have. A curious person experiences an ongoing itch. It's a desire to know how the world works. And that sounds like a bad thing until you realize that it's a wonderfully easy itch to scratch. You just head to the library, or these days you head to the internet. Also, scratching it feels absolutely wonderful. You know, kind of the way scratching a mosquito bite feels good, except scratch a mosquito bite, ooh, and you might get infected. Scratch the itch of curiosity and you become more knowledgeable. So it's a wonderful thing. One excellent way to regain your sense of wonder about the world around you is to learn or maybe relearn some science. The more you learn, the more you will want to know. Learn a bit of astronomy, geology, and biology, and the universe can be your playground. I'll give you one random example. So somebody, you might be walking through a field with somebody, they might see a boulder that seems out of place. Okay, if you know a little bit of geology, you'll realize the boulder is a glacial, what's called a glacial erratic, that came here from Canada 20,000 years ago by a glacier that might have been 1,000 feet high in that very field. And of course, if the rock in question has fossils, your imagination might drift to the tropical sea that covered Canada 200 million years ago, 300 million years ago. There are a lot of people I encounter who are bored. My advice would be learn some science and you just never need to be bored again. There's so much to learn. I've got a kind of a background research project going on right now on what's called Big History. So it's the history of mankind beginning with the Big Bang. So it covers a lot of ground. Last count, I'm 40 books into this research project, and reading those 40 books has only whetted my appetite to learn more. And I find myself going off on these bizarre side trips where I'll become fascinated by mitochondria. These are these little organelles within your cells that are the powerhouses. And my neighbors and friends have picked up on what I've been reading, because I'll start peppering them with what I call fabulous facts, about organelles, about rocks, about neutrinos, and I hope they're amused. I'm not quite sure, though. Another benefit, so we talked about the benefits of sports and of hobbies, but a benefit of reawakening your curiosity is doing all this kind of research and learning all this stuff will keep your mind active, which I think is an important thing if you want to slow the rate of decline of your thoughts. Now, it takes courage to embark on a second childhood because the serious adults around you are going to disapprove. There's a real danger that they're going to do that. So some people, instead of wholeheartedly embarking on a second childhood, they cheat. They exploit their grandchildren. Okay? So more precisely, their second childhood consists of vicariously participating in their grandchild's first childhood. Yes, they played this afternoon, but only because little Johnny asked them to. Yes, they went to the library and got a book on butterflies, but only because little Susie had been asking questions. Okay, there's two problems with this particular strategy for having a second childhood. The first is that having grandchildren requires the possession of children of your own who can become parents of the grandchildren. Not only that, but for the plan to work, the children have to be in a procreative mood. Now, you can drop hints. You can send them off on all expenses paid vacations to romantic locales. But there's no guarantee that anything will come of it. And even if something does, there's no guarantee that they're going to move in across the street, so you'll have reliable access to these grandchildren they've made. The second problem with trying to get a second childhood via your grandchildren is that it's just not the same thing to watch a first childhood as opposed to actually having one. So my advice is when your time comes, boldly embark on your own second childhood. If you're lucky enough to have a grandchild, when you start your adventure, fine. They can become your playmate. They can join you. I hope my comments tonight seemed plausible to those of you who are presently old. I readily admit that you have more experience of old age than I do. I am at best youthfully old. I also hope my comments were useful to those of you who hope someday to be old. Many of you, I suspect, have already done a considerable amount of financial planning with respect to your old age and your retirement. I'm encouraging you to develop a philosophical plan for your old age, and I would also add that I suspect that the philosophical plan you form can have a greater impact on your future well-being than the financial plan will. It's possible to spend the final years of your life angry, isolated, and embittered. It's also possible to spend them embarked on new adventures, excited by the prospect of the coming days and the activities that lie in store. The choice is yours. And as far as the possibility of having a second childhood is concerned, I'm going to end this evening with the wise words not of an ancient philosopher, but of a modern novelist, namely Tom Robbins. It's never too late, he said, to have a happy childhood. Thank you very much for coming tonight.
Not bad for a whippersnapper. We have time for a few questions for Professor Irvine. Just raise your hands. The curmudgeon here.
Would you spell that, please? As a physician, I'm just wondering how much of this you can correlate to brain science, to medical science, or is it all ephemeral and ethereal?
You mean the claims about how the various activities of old age can affect the rate of decline in specific?
That's one specific. But
Okay. It's an interesting thing. It's debatable. So you hear a lot of kind of commentary one way or another. But here's the interesting thing. I would argue that even if it didn't slow the rate of decline, even if that were factually true, the quality of life is going to be better in whatever years you have left. So that alone. And if it also slows the rate of decline, well, then it's a twofer, right? So you get more years of higher quality life.
thank you. Well, getting old is not so good, but sure as hell beats what's ever in second place.
I know. At one version of this paper, I had an extended discussion of my attempts to find mentors among older people. And there were two candidates that I really thought this is somebody who has insight. In both cases, when I finally took them aside and said, tell me what's the most important thing. It's the most important advice you have to pass on. Independently, they both gave the same advice. And they said, don't get old. And immediately you think, well, let's see. That means dying young, which doesn't sound like a good way to go. So, yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I want to first declare myself as a Stoic now, after listening to you. What I would like to ask is that most of the things, especially in the later part of your talk, that you included positive effort, positive attitude that we have to gain as an individual. But I would like to ask, as a society, do we have enough drivers, enough motivators for individuals to acquire this positive attitude?
I think as a society, and in the book on Stoics, later chapters, I talk about this, there are forces at work. And I made the one comment that if you're a Stoic, you take responsibility for your own unhappiness. But there are forces at work in our culture, both political forces and psychological forces that say if you're unhappy, there's an external cause for it. And what you need to do is fix the external cause. And I don't want you to get the wrong idea there. The Stoics were very big on finding injustices in the world and correcting those. At the same time, they said it's foolish to let those injustices ruin your life. And they said if you pick the right values and have the right strategies, you can be in the recipient of extreme injustice and still thrive. A classic example, Musonius Rufus. Well, all of the Stoics tended to get themselves banished. Of the four great Roman Stoics I talked about, Seneca, Epictetus, and Musonius Rufus all were banished. Marcus Aurelius wasn't, but he was emperor. So who was gonna banish him? And the interesting thing was, so they endured this hardship. They seemed to thrive nonetheless. The other thing, Epictetus started out as a slave and yet rose above that. But I think we get the message, it's both a psychological thing and a political thing, that if you're unhappy, it's because something outside has to change for you to gain happiness. With the Stoics, it's nope. Internally, work on your own happiness, take responsibility for it, and at the same time, work externally to change the conditions that you think are improper.
This is good. Make market.
So, there's an old adage that if always expect the worst and you won't be disappointed.
Yep.
Right? But you're saying that Stoics, they take time to imagine the bad things that can happen,
Yep.
and then it makes them really appreciate what they have.
Yep.
But do Stoics take time to visualize the positive? Because, it seems like what Stoics are doing is flies in the face of what a lot of people believe. You should visualize the good things that are going to come about in your life. And so do they take time to do both of those, or is it just, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
I mean, the biggest single thing, and when I tell people about negative visualization, they will always tell me about some relative they've got who just always goes around, saying, oh, here's the bad things that can happen. And then, so the first qualification is it isn't an ongoing thing. I mean, at my current rate of doing it, it's flickering thoughts a few times a day, and it's about the people I know. It's about the circumstances of my life. It's a psychological trick, but an effective psychological trick. So you might as well use it. The other thing about the Stoics, and so this is something I in one version of this I did get into, but I needed to cut back for time constraints. The Stoics did believe in planning for the future. They did have a hopeful, optimistic outlook about the future. They're accused of pessimism. But here's one interesting strategy that they used. They internalized their goals. So they formed a whole bunch of ambitious goals, but they were careful for the goals to be internal. And here's an explanation of that. Suppose, as an athlete, you decide you're going to take up competitive tennis. You can go into a tennis match and your goal can be to win the match. Well, that's something you don't have control over. But you do have complete control over how hard you practice, how thoroughly you practice, how hard you play that day. So the Stoics would have any number of goals and plans and hopes and dreams, but they would try to keep them internalized to the extent possible, things they have control over. And oh, by the way, the internal and the external are linked, because if you are doing it to the best of your ability and you lose, hey, you have nothing to feel bad about. You did your best. Yeah.
I just wanted to offer another opportunity to play, and that would be to study the history of mathematics, because seeing how mathematics developed and the various things that were introduced in our history is most interesting and can again be an opportunity for play.
Yeah, I'm just absolutely huge on science, but history would have been my second thing of learned some history, because it truly is amazing. There's a sense in which I'm doing history, but not human history. What was the universe doing, between, 1 and 2 billion years after it's, but history is fascinating. Learn a language. It becomes increasingly hard as you get old, but there are a number of things. And see, learn a language, that can also be part of an adventure. Go to the country where they speak the language you've learned. Try to get along with that language. The advice also on what to do when you're old is actually advice on what to do throughout your life. There are different ways to approach life, and to be an active participant, to be an adventurer. And there's capital A adventure and there's little a adventure. And the capital A adventure I tend to shy away from because my wife says I can't, for one thing. But little a adventures are all over the place. Another kind of bit of advice: a few times a year you should go out of your way to do something that makes you feel uncomfortable, that gives you butterflies, because it will be a very important growth experience. And in the book on Stoics, I describe my own efforts to learn how to play the banjo. As a kid, I dodged the bullet. I managed to never pick up a musical instrument ever. And my friends around me were having to, practice for however much time every day and getting called out of, our play so they could go practice and everything else. And I just thought I was the cleverest kid on the planet. I didn't have to do any of that. And then as an adult, it occurred to me, I might have missed something important. An important experience. Took up the banjo. Banjo teacher said, we've got a recital. Are you interested? And I said, no way. And then I thought about it and I thought, well, sure. And then he explained that it would be me and a bunch of 8, 9, and 10-year-olds playing before the relatives of the kids, pretty much. And, I'm used to walking into a classroom with 60 kids, a lecture like this with adults and so on. That was the scariest thing I've ever done. It was almost like an out-of-body experience. And butterflies, it was beyond butterflies. It was medium-sized bats, flying around within me. But here's the interesting thing. As a result of that, any challenge now that I've got, I have this frame of reference. Well, I gave the banjo recital. This couldn't be as bad as that. And then back to capital A adventures. I mean, think about somebody who climbs Mount Everest. A foolish thing to do. You have, a 1 in 6 chance of dying on your way back down, blah, blah, blah. Don't do it. But if you do it, and life offers you, some kind of challenge, I mean, in the back of your mind, you can think, could I do that? Well, I climbed Mount Everest. I think I probably could. You gain that sense of self-confidence. So that whole idea, and again, it goes against kind of the national trend. Why do something hard? And the answer is because it's hard. And because if you do it, and you do your best, and you succeed in doing it, you will have gained something very important. There'll be something in your back pocket that you can pull out someday when you need it. And it'll give you just that kind of courage and incentive that you need to go on and do something else. Yeah?
When is your new book coming out?
The new book was actually written, it's just such a long story. I kind of thought that as an author, the way it worked is you publish a book and then it's easy. Turns out not. And this book, it's just been a long process. It's actually existed in a complete form for a few years. Oxford University Press turned it down once, then took a new interest in it, and went through a long process. The contract has not been signed, but word is that we're very close. So normal books, it's a curious thing about this, from the time the contract is signed to when the book appears is 9 months. And I think it's tied into the human gestation period. I never quite understood that, and people have tried to explain this should be quicker than that. So, because it is basically a done book. So, next year sometime, and I'm looking forward to it because the books are like children, and this book was starting to look like the kid who would never move out of his bedroom, never go out and get a job and send money home or whatever it's supposed to do.
Well, one last question.
Which book that you've written already most closely talks about what your lecture was?
The Stoics book. The books in order, the Desire book, this book was a sequel to the book called On Desire. In reading On Desire, I had to read the Stoics. Actually went into On Desire thinking I'm going to come out of it a practicing Zen Buddhist. That was the plan. Went in, discovered the Stoics, and then the more I learned about Zen Buddhists, the more I realized, well, that's not going to work for me. Came out a Stoic, so it's an interesting sequel. The Insults book, which is the one that's coming next, is a sequel to this book, because there's one chapter in this book on insults that I noticed kept getting bigger and bigger. I call it a literary tumor, you know. It's there in the book, but it's got a life of its own, and then you realize it wants to be a book. So yeah, and this is actually kind of more accessible than the Desire book is. So if you were going to get one, that's the one I would get.
And I urge you to get that.
We have one last hand here that's, yeah.
Just one more. Okay.
One subject which is not touched upon at all, and that's health. There's a lot of people, I'm sure, right here in this room who are experiencing pain, physical pain, maybe dying of shoe, or maybe knowledge that they're in declining health, that there's real pain. And I think it takes no courage to swim an extra kilometer if you can, or to learn a new language, to travel to an exotic foreign country. But I think it takes a lot of courage to fight pain, and to fight decline. That's courage.
Okay.
To be cheerful, and not complain, and not share your pain with others. It's a very quiet, retiring thing. It's not an outgoing thing.
I agree. To repeat the question is a Stoic response to pain. I've lived a blessed existence. Occasions have experienced pain. Headaches, I don't get them. I don't know why it is. It's curious, though, the people who deal with me get them routinely. So there is one theory that I'm an asymptomatic carrier of headaches. But the pain, I agree, it's an absolutely huge thing, and just lurks, and to some extent you're powerless to deal with it.
Well, pain particularly that comes with declining health.
Yes.
Which is the major arena of combat
Yeah.
for aging.
Well, it is a problem, and of course there are different ways of dealing with it. I mean, just as far as you express. Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't have good advice that I can offer, and therefore will refrain.
It's really wonderful when a lecture brings things together in both in expected and unexpected ways. Those of you who've come to the series for several years now will remember that in the first year, one of our premier speakers was Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who spoke about flow and creativity.
I was going to mention him, but I couldn't pronounce his name.
We learned that. And a better example of growing old with vigor and grace and excitement you wouldn't find than Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. The other is you toward the end you mentioned it's your choice, and Laura Carstensen, our first speaker, I believe, wrote an essay called "Growing Old or Living Long." It's your choice. This was a fabulous lecture. It brought things together. It excited me, and I know the listeners. So go live well. I would add, after you read his book, while you're waiting for the Insults book to come out, read Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius and Seneca.
Absolutely.
Because there's great wisdom to be found in their thoughts. We have much with which to fill the years that the researchers like Denise Park and Michael Rudd and their colleagues are giving us. Thank you, Bill Irvine.
Thank you all.